Life by Bessie Head. In 1963, when the borders were first set up between Botswana and South Africa, pending Botswana's independence in 1966, all Botswana-born citizens had to return home. Everything had been mingled up in the old colonial days, and the traffic of people to and fro between the two countries had been a steady flow for years and years. More often, especially if there were migrant laborers working in the mines, their period of settlement was brief, but many people had settled there in permanent employment. It was these settlers who were disrupted and sent back to village life in a mainly rural country. On their return, they brought with them bits and bits of a foreign culture and city habits which they had absorbed. Village people reacted in their own way. What they liked and was beneficial to them, they absorbed. For instance, the faith-healing cult churches which instantly took hold like wildfire. What was harmful to them, they rejected. The murder of life had this complicated undertone of rejection. Life had left the village as a little girl of 10 years old with her parents for Johannesburg. They had died in the meanwhile, and on Life's return, 17 years later, she found, as was village custom, that she still had a home in the village. On mentioning that her name was Life Murapedi, the villagers immediately and obligingly took her to the Murapedi yard in the central part of the village. The family yard had remained intact, just as they had left it, except that it looked pathetic in its desolation. The thatch of the mud huts had patches of soil over them, where the ants had made their nests. The wooden poles that supported the rafters of the huts had tilted to an angle, as their base had been eaten through by the ants. The rubber hedge had grown to a disproportionate size and enclosed the yard in a gloom of shadows that kept out the sunlight. Weeds and grass of many seasonal rains entangled themselves in the yard. Life's future neighbors, a group of women, continued to stand near her. "We can help you put your yard in order," they said kindly. "We are very happy that a child of ours has returned home." They were impressed with the smartness of the city girl. They generally wore old clothes and kept their best things for special occasions like weddings. And even then, those best things might just be ordinary cotton prints. The girl wore an expensive cream costume of linen material, tailored to fit her tall, full figure. She had a bright, vivacious, friendly manner and laughed freely and loudly. Her speech was rapid and a little hysterical, but that was in keeping with her whole personality. "She is going to bring us a little light," the women said among themselves as they went off to fetch their work tools. They were also looking for the light, and by that they meant that they were ever alert to receive new ideas that would freshen up the ordinariness and everydayness of village life. A woman who lived near the Murapedi yard had offered Life hospitality until her own yard was in order. She picked up the shining new suitcases and preceded Life to her own home, where Life was immediately surrounded with all kinds of endearing attentions. A low stool was placed in a shady place for her to sit on. A little girl came shyly forward with a bowl of water for her to wash her hands. And following on this, a tray with a bowl of meat and porridge was set before her so that she could revive herself after her long journey home. The other women briskly entered her yard with hoes to scratch out the weeds and grass, baskets of earth and buckets of water to re-smear the mud walls, and they found 2 idle men to rectify the precarious tilt of the wooden poles of the mud hut. These were the sort of gestures people always offered, but they were pleased to note that the newcomer seemed to have an endless stream of money, which she flung around generously. The work party in her yard would suggest that the meat of a goat, slowly simmering in a great iron pot, would help the work to move with a swing, and life would immediately produce the money to purchase the goat, and also tea, milk, sugar, pots of porridge, or anything the workers expressed a preference for, so that those 2 weeks of making life's yard beautiful for her seemed like one long wedding feast. People usually only ate that much at weddings. "How is it that you have so much money, our child?" one of the women at last asked curiously. "Money flows like water in Johannesburg," Life replied, with her gay and hysterical laugh. "Hey, you have to know how to get it." The women received this with caution. They said among themselves that their child could not have lived a very good life in Johannesburg. Thrift and honesty were the dominant themes of village life, and everyone knew that one could not be honest and rich at the same time. They counted every penny and knew how they had acquired it, with hard work. They never imagined money as a bottomless pit without end. It always had an end, and was hard to come by in this dry, semi-desert land. They predicted that she would soon settle down. Intelligent girls got jobs in the post office sooner or later. Life had had the sort of varied career that a city like Johannesburg offered a lot of black women. She had been a singer, a beauty queen, an advertising model, and a prostitute. None of these careers were available in the village. For the illiterate women, there was farming and housework. For the literate, teaching, nursing, and clerical work. The first wave of women life attracted to herself were the farmers and housewives. They were the intensely conservative, hardcore center of village life. It did not take them long to shun her completely, because men started turning up in an unending stream. What caused a stir of amazement was that Life was the first and the only woman in the village to make a business out of selling herself. The men were paying her for her services. People's attitudes to sex was broad and generous. It was recognized as a necessary part of human life, that it ought to be available whenever possible, like food and water, or else one's life would be extinguished, or one would get dreadfully ill. To prevent these catastrophes from happening, men and women generally had a lot of sex, but on a respectable and human level, with financial considerations coming in as an afterthought. When the news spread around that this had now become a business in Life's yard, she attracted to herself a second wave of women, the beer brewers of the village. The beer brewing women were a gay and lovable crowd who had emancipated themselves some time ago. They were drunk every day and could be seen staggering around the village, usually with a wide-eyed, illegitimate baby hitched onto their hips. They also talked and laughed loudly and slapped each other on the back and had developed a language of their own. Boyfriends, yes. Husbands, no. Do this, do that. We want to rule ourselves. But they too were subject to the respectable order of village life. Many men passed through their lives, but they were all for a time steady boyfriends. Their usual arrangement was, Mother, you help me and I'll help you. This was just so much eyewash. The men hung around, lived on the resources of the women, and during all this time, they would part with about 2 rand of their own money. After about 3 months, a tally up would be made. Boyfriend, the woman would say. Love is love and money is money. You owe me money. And it'd never be seen again. But another scoundrel would take his place. And so the story went on and on and on. They found their queen in life. And like all queens, they set her activities apart from themselves. They never attempted to extract money from the constant stream of men because they did not know how. But they liked her yard. Very soon, the din and riot of a Johannesburg township was duplicated on a minor scale in the central part of the village. A transistor radio blurred the day long. Men and women reeled around drunk and laughing, and food and drinks flowed like milk and honey. The people of the surrounding village watched this phenomenon with pursed lips and commented darkly, "They'll all be destroyed. They'll all be destroyed one day, like Sodom and Gomorrah." Life, like the beer-brewing women, had a language of her own too. When her friends expressed surprise at the large quantities of steak, eggs, liver, kidneys, and rice they ate in her yard, the sort of food they too could now and then afford, but would not dream of purchasing, she replied in a carefree, offhand way, "I'm used to handling big money." They did not believe it. They were too solid to trust this kind of luck, which had such shaky foundations, and as though to offset some doom that might just be around the corner, they often brought along their own scraggy village chickens reared in their yards as offerings for their day's round of meals. And one of life's philosophies on life, which were too dangerous, and one which she would recall with trembling a few months later, was, "My motto is, live fast, die young, and make sure you have a good-looking corpse." All this was said with the bold, free joy of a woman who had broken all the social taboos. They never followed her to those dizzy heights. A few months after Life's arrival in the village, the first hotel with its pub opened. It was initially shunned by all the women, and even the beer brewers considered they hadn't fallen that low yet. The pub was also associated with the idea of selling oneself. It became Life's favorite business venues. It simplified the business of making appointments for the following day. None of the men questioned their behavior, nor how such an unnatural situation had been allowed to develop. They could get all the sex they needed for free in the village, but it seemed to fascinate them that they should be paying for it for the first time. They had quickly got to the stage where they communicated with Life in shorthand language. "When?" And she would reply, 10 o'clock. "When?" 2 o'clock. "When?" 4 o'clock. And so on, and so on. And there would be the roar of cheap small talk and much buttock slapping. It was her element, and her feverish, glittering, brilliant black eyes that swept around the bar, looking for everything and nothing at the same time. Then one evening, Death walked quietly into the bar. It was Lesego, the cattleman. He came from his cattle post, where he had been occupied for a period of 3 months. Men built up their own individual reputations in the village, and Lesegos was one of the most respected and honorable. People said of him, "When Lesego has got money and you need it, he will give it to you. He will give you what he has got, and he won't trouble you about the date of payment." He was honored for another reason also, for the clarity and quiet indifference of his thinking. People often found difficulty in sorting out issues or the truth in any debatable matter. He had a way of keeping his head above water, listening to an argument, and always pronouncing the final judgment. Well, the truth about this matter is he was also one of the most successful cattlemen with a balance of 7,000 rand in the bank. And whenever he came into the village, he lounged around and gossiped or attended village khotla meetings. So people even had a saying, "I must be getting about my business. I'm not like Lesego with money in the bank." As usual, the brilliant radar eyes swept feverishly around the bar. They did the rounds twice that evening in the same manner, each time coming to a dead stop for a full second on the thin, dark, concentrated expression of Lesego's face. There wasn't any other man in the bar with that expression. They all had sheepish, inane-looking faces. He was the nearest thing that life had seen for a long time to the Johannesburg gangsters she had associated with. The same small economical gestures, the same power and control. All the men near him quietened down and began to consult with him in low, earnest voices. They were talking about the news of the day, which never reached the remote cattle posts, whereas all the men had to approach her. The third time her radar eyes swept round, he stood his ground, turned his head slowly, and then jerked it back slightly in silent command. "Come here." She moved immediately to his end of the bar. "Hello," he said, in an astonishingly tender voice, and a smile flickered across his dark, reserved face. That was the sum total of Lesego. That basically he was a kind and tender man, that he liked women and had been so successful in that sphere that he took his dominance and success for granted. But they looked at each other from their own worlds and came to fatal conclusions. She saw in him the power and maleness of the gangsters. He saw the freshness and surprise of an entirely new kind of woman. He had left all his women after a time because they bored him. And like all people who live an ordinary humdrum life, he was attracted to that undertone of hysteria in her. Very soon, they stood up and walked out together. A shocked silence fell upon the bar. The men exchanged looks with each other, and the way these things communicated themselves, they knew that all other appointments had been cancelled while Lesego was there. As though speaking their thoughts aloud, Sianana, one of Lesego's friends, commented, "Lesego just wants to try it out like we all did, because it is something new. He won't stay there when he finds out that this thing is rotten to the core." But Sianana was to find out that he did not fully understand his friend. Lesego was not seen at his usual lounging places for a week, and when he emerged again, it was announced that he was to marry. The news was received with cold hostility. Everyone talked of nothing else. It was as impossible as if a crime was being committed before their very eyes. Sianana once more made himself the spokesman. He waylaid Lesego on his way to the village Lekgotla. "I am surprised by the rumors about you, Lesego," he said bluntly. "You can't marry that woman. She's a terrible fuckabout." Lesego stared back at him steadily. Then he said in his quiet, indifferent way, "Who isn't here?" Sianana shrugged his shoulders. The subtleties were beyond him. But whatever else was going on, it wasn't commercial. It was human. But did that make it any better? Lesego liked to bugger up an argument like that with a straightforward point. As they walked along together, Sianana shook his head several times to indicate that something important was eluding him, until at last, with a smile, Lesego said, "She has told me about all her bad ways. They are over." Sianana merely compressed his lips and remained silent. Life made the announcement too after she was married to all her beer brewing friends. "All my old ways are over," she said. "I have now become a new woman." She still looked happy and hysterical. Everything came to her too easily. Men, money, and now marriage. The beer brewers were not slow to point out to her with the same amazement with which they had exclaimed over the steak and eggs that there were many women in the village who had cried their eyes out over Lesego. She was merely flattered by all of this. Their lives, at least Lesego's, did not change much with marriage. He still liked lounging around the village. The rainy season had come and life was easy for the cattlemen at this time because there was enough water and grazing for the animals. He wasn't the kind of man to fuss about the house, and during his time, he only made 3 pronouncements about the household. He took control of all the money. She had to ask him for it and state what it was to be used for. Then he didn't like the transistor radio blaring the whole day long. "Women who keep that thing going the whole day have nothing in their heads," he said. Then he looked down at her from a great height and commented finally and quietly, "If you go with those men again, I'll kill you." This was said so indifferently and quietly, as though he never really expected his authority and dominance to encounter any challenge. She hadn't the mental equipment to analyze what had hit her, but something seemed to strike her a terrible blow behind the head. She instantly succumbed to the blow and rapidly began to fall apart. On the surface, the everyday round of village life was deadly dull in its even, unbroken monotony. One day slipped easily into another, drawing water, stamping corn, and cooking food. But within this, there were enormous tugs and pulls between people. Custom demanded that people care about each other, and all day long there was this constant traffic of people in and out of each other's lives. Someone had to be buried. Sympathy and help were demanded for this event. There were money loans, newborn babies, sorrow, trouble, gifts. Lesego had long been the king of this world. There was every day a long string of people wanting something or wanting to give him something in gratitude for a past favor. It was the basic strength of village life. It created people whose sympathetic and emotional responses were always fully awakened, and it rewarded them by richly filling in a void that was one big gaping yawn. When the hysteria and cheap rowdiness were taken away, life fell into a yawn. She had nothing inside herself to cope with this way of life that had finally caught up with her. The beer brewing women were still there. They still liked her yard because Lesego was casual and easygoing, and all that went on in it now, like the old men squatting in corners with gifts. "Lesego, I had good luck with my hunting today. I caught 2 rabbits and I want to share one with you," was simply the Tswana way of life that they too lived. In keeping with their queen's new status, they said, "We are women and we must do something." They collected earth and dung and smeared and decorated life's courtyard. They drew water for her, stamped her corn, and things looked quite ordinary on the surface because Lesego also liked a pot of beer. No one noticed the expression of anguish that had crept into Life's face. The boredom of the daily round was almost throttling her to death, and no matter which way she looked, from the beer brewers to her husband to all the people who called, she found no one with whom she could communicate what had become an actual physical pain. After a month, she was near collapse. One morning, she mentioned her agony to the beer brewers. "I think I have made a mistake. Married life doesn't suit me." And they replied sympathetically, "No, you're just getting used to it. After all, it's a different life in Johannesburg." The neighbors went further. They were impressed by a marriage they thought could never succeed. They started saying that one never ought to judge a human being who was both good and bad. And Lesego had turned a bad woman into a good woman, which was something they had never seen before. Just as they were saying this and nodding their approval, Sodom and Gomorrah started up all over again. Lesego had received word late in the evening that the newborn calves at his cattle posts were dying, and early the next morning he was off again in his truck. The old, reckless, wild woman awakened from a state near death with a huge sigh of relief. The transistor blared. The food flowed again. The men and women reeled around dead drunk. Simply by their din, they beat off all the unwanted guests who nodded their heads grimly. When Lesego came back, they were going to tell him that this was no wife for him. 3 days later, Lesego unexpectedly was back in the village. The calves were all anemic, and they had to be brought into the vet for an injection. He drove his truck straight through the village to the vet's camp. One of the beer brewers saw him and hurried in alarm to her friend. "The husband is back! The husband is back!" she said fearfully, pulling Life to one side. "Ach," she replied irritably. She did dispel the noise, the men, and the drink, but a wild anger was driving her to break out of the way of life that was like death to her. She told one of the men she'd see him at 6 o'clock. At about 5 o'clock, Lesego drove into the yard with the calves. There was no one immediately around to greet him. He jumped out of the truck and walked to one of the huts. Pushing open the door, Life was sitting on the bed. She looked up silently and sullenly. He was a little surprised, but his mind was still distracted by the calves. He had to settle them in the yard for the night. "Will you make some tea?" he said. "I'm very thirsty." "There's no sugar in the house," she said. "I'll have to get some." Something irritated him, but he hurried back to the calves, and his wife walked out of the yard. Lesego had just settled the calves when a neighbor walked in. He was very angry. "Lesego," he said bluntly, "we told you not to marry that woman. If you go to the yard of Raditobolo, if you go to the yard now, you'll find her in bed with him. Go and see for yourself that you may leave that bad woman." Lesego stared quietly at him for a moment. Then at his own pace, as though there were no haste or chaos in life, he went to the hut they used as a kitchen. A tin full of sugar stood there. He turned and found a knife in the corner, one of the large ones he used for slaughtering cattle, and slipped it into his shirt. Then at his own pace, he walked to the yard of Raditobolo. It looked deserted, except that the door of one of the huts was partially opened and one closed. He kicked open the door of the closed hut, and the man within shouted out in alarm. On seeing Lesego, he sprang, cowering into a corner. Lesego jerked his head back, indicating that the man should leave the room. But Raditobolo did not run far. He wanted to enjoy himself, so he pressed himself into the shadows of the rubber hedge. He expected the usual husband and wife scene. The irate husband cursing at the top of his voice, the wife hysterical in her lies and self-defense. Only Lesego walked out of the yard, and he held in his hand a huge blood-stained knife. On seeing the knife, Raditobolo immediately fell to the ground in a dead faint. There were a few people on the footpath, and they shrank into the rubber hedge at the sight of the knife. Very soon, a wail arose. People clutched at their heads and began running in all directions, crying, "Yo, yo, 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 yo," in their shock. It was some time before anyone thought of calling the police. They were so disordered because murder, outright and violent, was a most uncommon and rare occurrence in village life. It seemed that only Lesego kept cool that evening. He was sitting quietly in his yard when the whole police force came tearing in. They looked at him in horror and began to thoroughly upbraid him for looking so unperturbed. "You have taken a human life, and you are cool like that," they said angrily. "You are going to hang by the neck for this. It's a serious crime to take a human life." He did not hang by the neck. He kept that cool, head above water, indifferent look that he always had, right up to the day of his trial. Then he looked up at the judge and said calmly, "Well, the truth about this matter is, I had just returned from the cattle post. I had trouble with my calves that day. I came home late and, being thirsty, asked my wife to make me tea. She said there was no sugar in the house and left to buy some. My neighbor, Matata, came in after this and said that my wife was not at the shops, but in the yard of Raditobol. He said I ought to go and see what she was doing in the yard of Raditobol. I thought I would check up about the sugar first in the kitchen. I found a tin full of sugar. I was sorry and surprised to see this. Then a fire seemed to fill my heart. I thought that if she was doing a bad thing with Raditobol, as Matata had said, I'd better kill her, because I cannot understand a wife who could be so corrupt." Lesego had been doing this for years, passing judgment on all aspects of life in his straightforward, uncomplicated way. The judge, who was a white man, and therefore not involved in Tswana custom and its debates, was as much impressed by Lesego's manner as the village men had been. "This is a crime of passion," the judge said sympathetically. "So there are extenuating circumstances, but it is still a serious crime to take a human life. So I sentence you to 5 years imprisonment." Lesego's friend, Sianana, who was to take care of his business affairs while he was in jail, came to visit Lesego, still shaking his head. Something was eluding him about the whole business, as though it had been planned from the very beginning. "Lesego," he said, with deep sorrow, "why did you kill that fuckabout? You had the legs to walk away. You could have walked away. Are you trying to show us that rivers never cross here? There are good women and good men, but they seldom join their lives together. It's always this mess and foolishness." A song by Jim Reeves was very popular at that time. That's what happens when two worlds collide. When they were drunk, the beer brewing women used to sing it and start weeping. Maybe they had the last word on the whole affair.